The grand ballroom of Ashford Manor glittered like a jewel against the cold night. Chandeliers dripped with golden light, spilling over velvet draperies, mirrored walls and polished marble floors that reflected the swirl of gowns and tails, as if the heavens themselves had descended to dance among mortals. For the noble families of London, this was the highlight of the winter season, an evening to flaunt silks, fortunes and titles. Yet in the midst of this spectacle, one figure moved unseen, gliding along the edges of the crowd, with a silver tray balanced delicately in her hands. Her name was Clara Whitlow, and to most of the guests she was invisible, less than invisible in fact, for she was a servant. At 21 she had already learned the art of slipping between the cracks of aristocratic grandeur, her dark auburn hair pinned neatly beneath a modest cap, her grey dress plain but pressed, her emerald green eyes lowered as she carried crystal glasses of champagne to those who would never know her name. To the gathered elite, she was nothing but part of the furniture, like the gilded sconces or the polished silver. And yet, as she passed, whispers followed her like smoke. Imagine a servant girl standing in the ballroom, one lady sneered, her ostrich feather fan fluttering as she leaned toward her companion. Does the Duke employ no sense of propriety? Another chuckled behind his glass of port. Pretty, though, if she remembers not to speak. A servant should be seen, not heard. The words pricked at Clara's ears, though she gave no sign of hearing them. Years of training had taught her to keep her chin steady, her expression serene, no matter what was said. Still, humiliation pressed hot against her chest as she continued her rounds, each cruel remark echoing in her mind. She was not like the glittering women twirling in gowns worth more than her father's entire yearly wages. She had been born into service. Her late father had been steward to the Earl of Pembroke, and when debts consumed her family, she had entered Ashford Manor to survive, but survival came at a cost. The grand balls she had once dreamed of attending as a child were not for her delight, but her duty. She was not a guest, not a lady, not someone worth a second glance. She was the girl who filled glasses, who carried trays, who swept into shadows when laughter rose too loud. Tonight, however, something gnawed more cruelly than usual. Perhaps it was the finery, the blinding glitter, the sickeningly sweet perfume of lilies that filled the hall. Or perhaps it was the realization that no matter how hard she worked, she would never be more than what they whispered, a servant. Clara steadied herself near a column, her tray half empty. She allowed herself a brief pause, lifting her eyes to the dancers. They spun in glittering arcs, jewels catching the light, men bowing with polished precision, women laughing like bells. It was another world, a dream, glimpsed through glass, forever unreachable. Her heart, though she had trained it to be still, ached with something like longing not for jewels or gowns, but for a moment where she was not defined by her station. Yet, if she noticed the grandeur, others noticed her too, though not kindly. Cassandra Fairchild, daughter of a wealthy baronet, and one of the most admired debutantes of the season, had already marked Clara for ridicule. Dressed in a gown of crimson silk that trailed like spilled wine, Cassandra approached her companions with a sly glance toward Clara. "Look there," she murmured, her voice pitched for nearby ears. "The Ashford staff grows bolder each year. Next, the footman will ask for a dance." Laughter bubbled around her like poisoned champagne. Clara's throat tightened, but she swallowed the pain, curtsying silently as she offered her tray to another guest. Her silence was her shield, but it felt thinner than ever beneath Cassandra's daggered smile. The night wore on, cruelly long. As she passed beneath the chandeliers once more, she caught her reflection in a gilded mirror, pale, tired, almost ghost-like among the vibrant colours. For a moment, she barely recognized herself. And then, in that fleeting glance, she saw something unexpected, a pair of storm-grey eyes fixed upon her from across the ballroom. The eyes belonged not to some mocking guest, but to a man who seemed carved of shadows and steel, Duke Edmund Blackthorne, master of Ashford Manor himself. He stood aloof from the dancers, a glass untouched in his hand, his expression unreadable. Yet his gaze did not flicker away as others did. It lingered, steady, as though he were studying not the servant's tray, nor her plain gown, but her face. Her. Clara's breath caught. She lowered her gaze instantly, cheeks burning, convinced she had imagined it. For what possible reason would the Duke notice a servant girl when the most dazzling ladies of London clamoured for his attention? And yet, as she moved on, her heart thudded with a new, unsettling awareness that for the first time in her life she had been seen. The Duke of Ashford, Edmund Blackthorne, was a man whose name carried weight like thunder before a storm. At 36, he was both feared and admired, his fortune vast, his estates sprawling across half of England, his lineage impeccable. Yet it was not his wealth nor his title that kept him at the centre of every whisper. It was his enigmatic presence. He had never married, never courted seriously, and despite being the most eligible bachelor of his generation, he seemed immune to the charms of London's brightest beauties. Some said he was too proud, others that he was too haunted. But tonight, as Clara moved quietly among the guests, his storm-grey eyes never wavered from her figure. Clara, unaware of the reason behind such scrutiny, tried to busy herself with her tray. She slipped between gilded chairs, refilled glasses, and adjusted place settings with practiced efficiency. Yet, no matter how she tried to convince herself otherwise, the weight of his gaze pressed against her back, sharp as a blade. Each time she dared lift her eyes, she found him still watching, his glass untouched, his lips pressed in thought, as though he were deciphering a puzzle only he could see. It was not until a minor accident disrupted the flow of the evening that their paths collided. A young lord, too flushed with wine, stumbled into a servant carrying a tureen of soup. The tray teetered, about to spill its scalding contents onto a dowager countess's gown, when Clara, quick as lightning, abandoned her post and caught the tray with both hands, steadying it before disaster struck. Gasps rose, the countess shrieked, then blinked in relief as not a drop touched her silks. Clara bowed low, murmuring apologies, her face flushed scarlet though it had been no fault of her own. She set the tureen down, her hands trembling slightly, and prepared for the inevitable scolding from someone who would accuse her of causing a scene. But instead, a voice deep and commanding spoke from behind her. Remarkable presence of mind. The ballroom seemed to pause. Clara turned slowly, and there he stood, the Duke himself closer now, his height towering, his dark hair catching the glow of the chandeliers, his grey eyes fixed upon her not with disdain, but with something she had never expected from such a man, respect. "I only did what was needed, Your Grace," Clara stammered, dropping into a curtsy so swift she nearly lost her balance. She wished the floor would swallow her whole. A servant was never to draw attention, let alone attract the notice of her master. Yet the Duke's gaze did not waver. "And you did it well," he said, his tone even, as though speaking to an equal. Then, almost as an afterthought but loud enough for others to hear, he added, "More grace in one action than I have seen in a dozen dances tonight." The words spread like ripples in a pond. Guests turned, eyebrows arched, whispers buzzing. The Duke had spoken to a servant? And worse, praised her? Clara felt heat crawl up her neck, shame mingling with confusion. She lowered her eyes, clutching her tray as if it were armor, and fled toward the servants' corridor, her heart pounding like a drum. Behind her, Cassandra Fairchild seethed. The heiress had been fluttering near the Duke all evening, angling for his notice, only to watch him waste words on a girl in grey muslin. She leaned to her companions, her lips curving into a venomous smile. "Did you hear? A servant girl has more grace than the daughters of noblemen. What a curious compliment, don't you think?" Laughter followed, sharp and cruel, though beneath her mask Cassandra trembled with jealousy. Meanwhile, Clara found refuge in the dim servants' hallway, pressing her back against the cool stone. Her breath came shallow, her palms damp. She had never spoken to the Duke before, never dared. Yet his words echoed in her ears, filling her with a dangerous warmth. What had he meant? Why had he looked at her like that? Hours later, when the guests gathered for the midnight waltz, Clara resumed her duties with mechanical precision. But as the music swelled and couples glided across the floor, she glanced toward the Duke once more. He stood at the edge of the dance floor, refusing all offers, his eyes scanning the room. And then, unmistakably, his gaze found hers again. She froze, her tray nearly slipping from her hands. Surely it was coincidence, surely he sought someone else. But when his lips curved, just barely, the faintest ghost of a smile, it was clear. The Duke of Ashford was watching her. The thought alone was enough to undo her. For the first time, Clara realized she was caught in something far larger than herself. A dangerous game of attention, whispers, and power. And no matter how she tried to shrink into the shadows, the Duke's eyes refused to let her vanish. By morning, the tale had already travelled beyond Ashford Manor. Servants whispered it in kitchens, ladies repeated it in drawing rooms, and by noon the gossip had reached the tea tables of Mayfair. The Duke of Ashford had spoken to a servant girl, praised her no less. In a city that lived on scandal, it was the choicest morsel of the season. For Clara, the day began with aching feet and a pounding heart. She had slept little after the ball, her mind replaying the Duke's words until dawn painted the horizon. She told herself it was nothing, an accident, a passing remark he had already forgotten. Yet when she entered the kitchens that morning, she felt every pair of eyes upon her. "Clara," one maid whispered, her tone dripping with curiosity. "Is it true? Did His Grace speak to you?" Another giggled, covering her mouth with flour-dusted fingers. "They say he called you graceful. Imagine, the Duke of Ashford calling anyone graceful." Clara shook her head, flushing crimson. He only wished to prevent embarrassment for the household. It meant nothing. But her protest fell on deaf ears. In a house that thrived on hierarchy, even a stray word from the Duke could upset the order like a toppled candlestick. Upstairs, the whispers grew sharper, more venomous. Cassandra Fairchild, humiliated by her lack of progress with the Duke, had taken it upon herself to fuel the fire. Draped in lavender silk, she sat among a group of simpering ladies and fanned herself with deliberate grace. "I heard she nearly spilled soup upon Lady Ashcombe," Cassandra declared, her voice pitched to carry. Had it not been for the Duke's intervention, the disaster would have ruined the evening. But instead of chastising her, he saw fit to indulge her. A dangerous mistake, if you ask me. The ladies tittered. "Perhaps he enjoys novelty," men often do. "Or perhaps," Cassandra said with a slow smile, "he enjoys playing games. A servant girl, after all, can never be anything more." Their laughter followed Clara wherever she went. She bore it with silent dignity, her chin lifted though her heart quailed. But the weight of their ridicule pressed heavy upon her chest, threatening to crush her spirit. Was she truly a fool for allowing even a flicker of warmth to take root in her heart? The next evening, Clara's duties brought her once more to the ballroom, this time for a supper party, smaller than the ball, yet no less glittering. She slipped between guests with practiced ease, refilling glasses, replenishing plates, trying to make herself invisible. Yet invisibility was no longer hers to claim. Wherever she walked, whispers followed, eyes narrowed, and fans fluttered like wings of vultures. And then, as though to drive a nail into the coffin of her composure, the Duke himself entered late, dressed in severe black. The room hushed at once, every woman's gaze turning toward him with hope. He bowed politely, accepted greetings, and then, without hesitation, his eyes sought Clara. The air seemed to thin. Clara's breath caught, her tray trembling in her hands. Surely he would look away, greet Cassandra, dance with a duchess's daughter. But no, he strode across the room, his steps measured, his presence commanding. And though he did not speak to her, though he passed by with nothing more than a glance, the intent was clear. He had sought her, and only her. The whispers erupted like thunder. "Did you see? He looked at her again. It's indecent. A duke and a servant, preposterous." Cassandra's lips curved into a cold smile. "It is nothing. The novelty will fade, but until it does—" She leaned toward her companions. "We shall remind the girl of her place." That reminder came swiftly. Later, as Clara carried a tray of crystal goblets, Cassandra brushed past her with calculated cruelty, sending the tray clattering to the floor. Shards scattered across the marble, wine spilling like blood. Gasps rose from the crowd. Clara dropped to her knees at once, gathering pieces with shaking hands, her face burning. "Clumsy girl," Cassandra sneered, her voice dripping with disdain. "One wonders how long the Duke's amusement will last once you show your true station." Clara's throat constricted, words trapped behind her lips. She longed to defend herself, to shout that the tray had been knocked from her hands, that she was not to blame. But she remained silent, the servant's shield of obedience holding fast, even as humiliation burned her alive. When she dared glance up, however, she saw him, the Duke, standing at the edge of the crowd, his eyes dark, his jaw clenched. He did not move, did not speak, but in that storm-grey gaze, Clara read something she had never imagined she might see. Anger, not at her, but at the cruelty wielded against her. For the first time, Clara wondered if perhaps she was not entirely alone. Yet the thought terrified her as much as it comforted her. To be noticed by the Duke was dangerous, to be defended by him could prove ruinous. And yet, as the night drew on and whispers swirled thicker, Clara could not silence the truth that beat inside her chest. She had become part of a scandal, whether she wished it or not. The grand spring masquerade at Ashford Manor promised to be the pinnacle of the season. Gold-draped columns framed the ballroom, strings of pearls wound through garlands of roses, and chandeliers glittered like constellations suspended above the crowd. The air pulsed with music, laughter, and the rustle of gowns. Nobility had gathered from across London, their silken masks concealing faces but not ambitions. Every young woman dreamed of catching the Duke's eye that evening. Every man sought his approval. None spared a thought for the servant girl moving quietly through the throng, except the Duke himself. Clara had been assigned to serve wine. She clutched her tray like a shield, weaving among gowns of sapphire and ivory, the whispers sharper than ever. "That's her. The servant the Duke watches." She tried to ignore them, tried to focus on her task, but each hushed laugh was a dagger, each sneer a wound. Cassandra Fairchild, glittering in emerald silk, seemed to haunt every corner with her mocking smile, her words pitched to carry. "What a pity the Duke finds amusement in charity cases." Clara's throat tightened, but she forced her expression into calm neutrality. She was invisible, she told herself. She had to be invisible. Yet her heart knew otherwise, for it had not forgotten the Duke's gaze, nor the storm she had glimpsed in his eyes when Cassandra had humiliated her. The orchestra struck up the opening chords of the waltz. Couples swirled into motion, silks flashing, jewels blazing beneath candlelight. Clara edged toward the shadows, tray balanced against her hip, praying the music might drown the whispers. And then, in a silence sharper than steel, the world shifted. The Duke of Ashford was crossing the ballroom. Every eye followed him as he strode past the line of noblewomen waiting for his hand. He passed Cassandra, whose smile faltered into disbelief. He passed duchesses, countesses, daughters of earls, all of them holding their breath. He walked as though none of them existed, his gaze fixed instead upon a single figure at the edge of the room. Clara. Clara froze. The tray nearly slipped from her grasp. Her breath caught, her heart hammering so loudly she feared the music would drown beneath it. "No," she thought wildly, "it cannot be me! Not here! Not now!" And then he stood before her. The Duke, tall and commanding, extended his gloved hand. His voice carried across the room, deep and deliberate. "Will you grant me this dance?" The ballroom gasped as one. Fans snapped open, murmurs erupted, scandalous and disbelieving. A servant? The Duke had asked a servant? Clara's legs trembled, her mind a blur of terror and wonder. She knew what was expected, to refuse, to flee, to vanish into the shadows. But when she looked into his grey eyes, steady and unyielding, she saw no mockery, no pity, only certainty. Her tray clattered to a side table, forgotten. Slowly her trembling hand rose to his. He closed his fingers around hers with a gentleness that stole her breath, and together they walked into the centre of the ballroom. The music swelled. Whispers died into stunned silence as the Duke of Ashford placed his hand upon Clara's waist and guided her into the waltz. She moved as if in a dream, her plain gown swaying against the silks of duchesses, her slippered feet gliding across marble she had once scrubbed. Every step was a rebellion, every turn a defiance of the order that had bound her. Clara's breath trembled, her cheeks flushed, yet beneath her fear bloomed a wild exhilaration. For the first time in her life she was not invisible, she was seen. Around them the crowd gaped, scandalized. Cassandra's face burned with fury, her fan trembling in her hand. "He makes a mockery of us all," she hissed to her companions. But no one could look away. The Duke's gaze never left Clara's. "Do not fear them," he murmured, his voice low enough for her ears alone. "Tonight you are mine to dance with. Let them whisper what they will." Her lips parted, 1,000 protests dying unspoken. She wanted to tell him it was madness, that he risked ruin. But her heart betrayed her, soaring as the music carried them across the floor. She let herself believe, if only for the length of the song, that she was more than what they whispered. When the final note rang out, silence hung heavy, broken only by the Duke's steady voice. "Thank you, Miss Whitlow." He bowed, pressing his lips to her hand before the astonished crowd. It was done. The whispers had turned to thunder. Clara's humiliation had become triumph, and nothing would ever be the same again. The morning after the masquerade dawned grey and bitter, as though the heavens themselves disapproved of what had transpired at Ashford Manor. Across London, tongues wagged faster than the carriages rolling down Mayfair. The scandal was all anyone could speak of. The Duke of Ashford, most powerful and sought-after man in England, had danced not with a duchess, not with a baronet's daughter, but with a servant. By breakfast, caricatures had been sketched and spread across the coffee houses, exaggerated drawings of a noble duke bowing to a maid with a feather duster still in hand. In parlours, ladies clutched pearls as they whispered. Gentlemen laughed, though uneasily, for even they knew the duke was not a man to mock without risk. "It is a fancy, nothing more," they said. "He tires of noble women and seeks amusement where he may. It will fade." Yet their voices betrayed a nervous tremor. At Ashford Manor, the storm hit Clara like a blow. She could scarcely step into the kitchens without every pair of eyes upon her. Some gazes were wide with awe, others sharp with envy, but most were laced with suspicion. "The Duke danced with you," a footman muttered, disbelief heavy in his tone. "A servant." Clara tried to defend herself, whispering, "I did not ask for it. He chose." But her words did little to soften the knives of resentment. Even among her own, she was no longer safe. Cassandra Fairchild, meanwhile, stoked the flames with glee. At tea the next afternoon, she performed her outrage with exquisite precision. Draped in mourning black, as though grieving society's downfall, she declared, "A duke of his stature cannot be allowed to destroy centuries of order. What message does it send if a servant girl may replace a lady?" Her companions, scandalized but eager, nodded vigorously. Cassandra's words spread like wildfire, her disdain shaping the opinions of many. It was not long before whispers reached even the newspapers. A gossip column penned with sly venom declared, "The Duke's cold heart may at last have been stirred, but by what? A lowly maid. One wonders whether the title of Duchess shall soon be won by calloused hands." Clara nearly wept when she saw the words, her name thinly veiled in cruel euphemism. The Duke, however, seemed unmoved. At supper, when guests gathered once more at Ashford, he entered with his usual gravity, seated himself at the head of the table, and conversed as though nothing in the world had changed. Clara served in silence, her hands trembling, waiting for a rebuke. But when she dared glance up, she caught his eyes upon her, calm, steady, almost reassuring. After the meal, Cassandra seized her chance. She approached the Duke as he lingered near the fire, her smile sharp as a dagger. "Your Grace, may I offer counsel? The world already doubts your judgment. A man of your station must tread carefully. A servant girl cannot hope to be your partner." The Duke's gaze cooled, though his tone remained civil. "And yet, Lady Cassandra, it was she, not you, who caught me, when I might have fallen into tedium." His words, though quietly spoken, struck like thunder. Cassandra paled, her lips tightening into a brittle smile, but she dared not press further. Clara, watching from the shadows, could scarcely believe her ears. He had defended her, publicly, deliberately, as though daring the world to challenge him. Yet the defence was dangerous. Each word sharpened the blade of scandal, cutting deeper into her fragile place in the household. That night, unable to bear the weight of her thoughts, Clara slipped into the servants' garden, seeking solace beneath the moonlight. She clutched her shawl, her breath trembling in the cool air. Why had he done it? Why risk his name, his power, for her? She was nothing. She had always been nothing. The crunch of footsteps startled her. She turned, and there he was, the Duke, his tall frame cloaked in shadow, his eyes silver beneath the moon. For a long moment neither spoke. Then in a voice low and steady, he said, "You need not fear them, Clara. Their whispers are wind. You stood with dignity when they sought to shame you. That is worth more than all their jewels." Her lips parted, a protest forming, but no sound came. His words wrapped around her like warmth against the chill, dangerous in their kindness. "Why?" she whispered at last, her voice trembling. "Why me?" The Duke's gaze softened, though his expression remained unreadable. "Because they see only what is convenient. I see more." And with that, he bowed his head, leaving her alone beneath the stars, her heart racing with fear and hope in equal measure. The crescendo of scandal reached its peak at the Ashford Summer Gala, the grandest event of the year. Nobility from across England gathered beneath the sweeping arches of the Duke's estate, their jewels flashing, their masks gleaming, their whispers sharper than the clink of crystal. The ballroom was a sea of silks and ambition, but beneath its glitter lay a storm. Every guest had come for one reason alone. They waited to see whether the Duke of Ashford would bury his shame or crown it. Clara had been ordered to serve once again, though this time her heart pounded like a drum of doom. The kitchen maids had warned her not to go near the ballroom, but she had no choice. She wore the same grey gown, the same apron, her hair pinned back with trembling hands. Invisible, she told herself. I must be invisible tonight. But the gods of fortune had other plans. As the orchestra struck the opening chords of the first waltz, Cassandra Fairchild stepped forward in a gown of emerald and gold, her mask shimmering like a queen's. She bowed before the Duke, her voice pitched sweetly for all to hear. "Your Grace, will you honour me with the first dance?" A hush fell, heavy and expectant. Here, at last, was his chance to restore order. One word, one dance with Cassandra, and all whispers would fade into silence. The nobility leaned forward, eager to forgive him if only he returned to their fold. The Duke looked at Cassandra, then past her, to the edge of the room where Clara stood with her tray, her eyes wide with dread. He moved. Gasps rippled like thunder as he walked straight past Cassandra, past duchesses and countesses, past every noblewoman vying for his hand, until he stood before Clara once more. The music faltered. Silence pressed against the walls. Clara shook her head, desperate, her lips forming a soundless plea. "No, not again! They will ruin you! They will ruin me!" But the Duke extended his hand, his voice carrying across the hall, deep and unyielding. "Clara Whitlow, will you dance with me?" The world stopped breathing. Clara's tray slipped from her fingers, goblets crashing against marble in a chorus of shattering glass. The sound seemed to seal her fate. Her heart thundered in her chest. She wanted to run, to hide, to vanish into the shadows, but something in his gaze held her fast, steadfast, unwavering, a vow unspoken. In that moment she understood this was not a whim, nor a passing fancy. This was his choice. Slowly, as though defying the weight of 1,000 years of tradition, Clara placed her hand in his. The room erupted. Some gasped, others muttered, a few even hissed. Cassandra's face twisted, her mask slipping as rage consumed her. But the Duke did not falter. He drew Clara into the centre of the floor, placed his hand upon her waist, and guided her into the waltz. The orchestra, stunned, resumed playing, and so they danced. Every turn, every step was a declaration. Clara's grey gown swirled against silks and satins, her simple slippers sliding across marble as though they belonged there. Her cheeks burned, her breath caught, but she moved with the grace of one who had nothing left to lose. The Duke's eyes never left hers, steady and proud, as though daring the world to deny them. Around them, scandal boiled. "Impossible!" hissed one matron. "He cannot marry her." "Then why does he hold her so?" another whispered. The music swelled, drowning the whispers, and as the final notes rang through the hall, the Duke brought Clara to a halt. He bowed low, then straightened, his voice clear as steel. I will not dance to their tune any longer. Tonight, I choose her. Shock shattered into chaos. Voices rose, fans fluttered, men barked protests. Cassandra stumbled forward, her mask torn away, her voice shrill with fury. She is nothing but a servant. You disgrace us all. The Duke turned, his gaze cold as winter. And yet she shows more dignity than any who mocked her. I would rather stand beside her, a servant, than beside you, a lady who knows only cruelty. The hall fell silent. Cassandra, trembling with rage, fled the ballroom, her skirts whipping behind her. None followed. The Duke turned back to Clara, who trembled in his arms, her eyes bright with unshed tears. You need not fear them, he murmured for her alone. Tonight you are no longer their servant. You are mine, if you will have me. The words broke her. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she whispered, Yes. The hall erupted once more, but this time applause thundered above the whispers. Not all approved, but none could deny what they had witnessed. The most powerful duke in England had chosen not wealth, not lineage, but love. And as the music rose again, Clara Whitlow, once nothing but a servant, stood in the arms of a duke, her future forever changed.